Please help me welcome Professor Kohn.
Thank you, Masha. Thank you, Masha, for these kind words. Now I know who I am. When I first set foot on this continent, that was in Boston at the end of the 70s, 1970s, the welcome committee was a little bit smaller, but very dedicated to help me along in this new culture. And I was so determined to meet the people. I loved the people I met. I wanted to learn the language. And one of my first role models of American English was Neil, my neighbor on Nahant, this little peninsula north of Boston where I lived with my family. But I soon found out that it was not that easy to become part of them. When I was talking with Neil and I wasn't sure about a certain expression or a construction, of course I needed feedback from him to help me. So I paused, nothing happened. I raised an eyebrow, again nothing happened. I put a big, huge question mark on my face, still Neil wouldn't react. And when I asked him point blank, Neil, can I say it like this? He would reply, never mind, I understand you. So there I was in the late 70s near Boston. And in the typical English as a foreign language situation, I want to be like you, and you don't seem to care. Well, this is anecdotal evidence of a typical ELT TESOL learner's background. Okay, you might succeed in school, you have good marks, but when you are in our case, when I went to school, when you are in England the first time, you can hardly survive. You don't know how to buy your hot dog. So these things, you know this. Well, deviations, and this is another thing. I wanted to get it right, and he didn't seem to care. Of course, this was due to my ELT background. Deviations from the native speaker English role model are at best tolerated. That's it. And this is deeply, deeply entrenched in learners' minds, not only in teachers' minds, but in learners' minds as well. Well, and today, there is certainly more emphasis in ELT on communication and communicative competence. There is greater tolerance for deviations than in my days in school. Particular these days, and now, the acronym, I believe, is new in the American context, CLIL. It's a European acronym, Content and Language Integrated Learning. I'll come back to that briefly later. It's basically what you also call bilingual teaching. So English is taught, history or biology, these subjects are taught in English or in French. And this is becoming quite popular and successful in German schools. And in these CLIL classrooms, there's certainly a greater tolerance for deviations. But it's not really exploited for language learning purposes. In educational regulations for schools, secondary schools, well, focus is on British Standard English, in brackets received pronunciation. Nobody speaks it anymore. I mean, hardly anybody. Or General American. either or. Never mix them up. For me, it would be impossible to keep these things clearly apart. Well, excellence, as it were, in ELT is still largely measured and experienced in terms of compliance with an externally given native speaker English role model. ELT pupils and students at school and university are being praised for meeting these norms. Deviations, as I said, may be tolerated, but they are not taken as evidence of success. Generally, communicative competence is the goal, but it is the communicative competence of native speakers. So when you look, for instance, at Merrill Swain's, Cummins and Swain's model of communicative competence, it's towards the native speaker. At the same time, however, English outside the ELT classroom has undergone dramatic changes. Let me start with a quote from an early publication by William Labov, referring to non-standard English, not to non-native speakers of English. But it's a similar issue. In the social linguistic study of language learning, we can begin with the fundamental observation that children do not speak like their parents. And we may add, learners do never speak like their teachers. You know David Gradle's contribution concerning the decline of the native speaker because of the rise of the non-native speaker in sheer numbers, and not in classrooms, but out there in real life, in real communication. Native speakers may feel the language belongs to them, but it will be those who speak English as a second or foreign language who will determine its world future. And Henry Whittleson, a quotation from his book published in 2003, but it actually goes back to a publication in 1994. And this was a publication of a keynote he gave, I believe, in 93 at TESOL. How English develops in the world is no business whatever of native speakers in England, in the United States, or anywhere else. They have no say in the matter, no right to intervene or pass judgment. So this brings up the issue of ownership. And now comes a quotation from a lesser known linguist, but I wanted to put it there because it's my voice as a non-native speaker of English. Owning a house, well, is one thing. It's nice, yes. However, making it one home is yet another. If non-native speakers accept ownership, they also need to begin to feel responsible for themselves before being able to shape the future of English. They need to get their own English into shape. But which direction should they take? A couple of years ago, I was sitting at a conference, English as a Lingua Franca conference, and I listened to a native speaker talk about English as a Lingua Franca, and I felt the double-edged nature of non-native speaker ownership. The native speaker presenter's message was that for a non-native speaker of English, a native speaker English orientation, which I definitely had, was fundamentally wrong. and impossible to pursue with any hope for success. The wall just too high to climb, the fruit too sweet, out of reach anyway, just not my social-linguistic reality. I found myself excluded from the enchanted garden, and I was not happy about it. But here I was, a kind of Faustian creature with two souls, a non-native speaker with a desire of some kind of native speaker English orientation. A desire I was told was unrealistic. A desire, however, that was part of my English self. This was when my personal quest into the nature of non-native speakers' ownership of English began, both as a researcher and as a native speaker myself. And I found my answer in a social constructivist understanding of non-native speaker ownership, that is a conceptualization of language learning as a cognitive, emotional, and behavioral creation of my English. And that will be the main topic of my talk today. So let's take a closer look at making English one's own. How do I make English my own? Well, the trivial reply is, I acquire it. But what does that mean? I acquire it. How do I acquire English? Compare acquiring a language with acquiring a car. The car is out there. You have to pay for it. You get it. It's your own. The language, in a way, is out there in the minds and behavior of other people you talk to. You may have to pay for your courses, your books. But is it like the car which you get and take and it is your own, that you take the language from out there and then it's your own? No. You actually need to take a kind of IKEA approach, right? You need to build it. You can only make it your own by developing, constructing, creating, not it, your own version of it. Your own version of it in your mind, in your heart, and in your behavior. That is how it works. And this creation process is influenced by a number of factors. First of all, well, the language which is your native language or other languages you know already before you start learning English. It is the target language model, of course, you pick. Your attitudes, your motivation, your goals and requirements, the learning approach, the effort you invest, all this shapes this constructivist creation process. And all this is not just an individual play, like when you build your IKEA cupboard. You are at home, maybe alone, maybe, well, certainly my wife will help me get it right. But it's a communicative social interaction context in which this takes place. And in this social constructivist sense, the English I develop is my own, my English. It is inevitably different from the target language model toward which it is oriented. And this is not an option. It is rather part of the human condition. This is how we learn, how we acquire languages. And this is why even in a situation where language learning, like in the good old behaviorist times, was mainly based on imitation, these imitation processes were construction processes with room for your own mark. There's just no other possibility. Let's have a closer look at what is involved in creating my English. It is about creating, of course, my communicative linguistic knowledge and skills regarding lexis, grammar, grammatical means of expression. But it's also about how I can use these grammatical and lexical means of expression to fulfill certain language and communication-related requirements regarding, for instance, what is or what I consider possible, appropriate, feasible, probable, to use Heims's model. And it is also about creating my requirements, my requirement profile. Just look at a little child. Up to a certain age, you cannot bother the little child with questions concerning correctness. It's all about meaning. But then at the age of 4 or 5, definitely when they go to school, this other dimension comes in. Look at immigrants in foreign language acquisition and how far they get with their acquisition process, strongly influenced by the requirements they set themselves. Or look at the ELT learner who is immersed into a Lingua Franca situation and then has to learn to shift his requirements from a more correctness-oriented set to a more communication-oriented set. Well, and last but not least, it is about creating my individual and social identity orientation. Who do I want to be? Am I comfortable with myself? This is usually neglected. In so many situations, along my own path of developing my English, native speakers, in particular in the States, reacted in a very positive way and wonderful, how great your English. And I did not feel like that. Who or what is my role model? In my case, it's some kind of native speaker English. In our educational system, it is a native speaker English role model. By whom do I want to be accepted? Desire for participation. Our students, they go to Scotland or Ireland for a semester and then they come back with a nice accent. The My English condition has interesting implications for a model of communicative competence. A model of communicative competence should not just deal with getting linguistic means of expression right in terms of possibility, appropriateness, feasibility, and probability. It's more than that. And it is more than being able to use linguistic means of expression for achieving certain communicative needs and purposes. It is, again, expressing oneself in keeping with one's individual and social identity. It is all about expressing oneself. And success is largely measured in terms of perceived success. Hearer satisfaction and speaker satisfaction is what is very important and needs to be incorporated in a model of communicative competence. The My English condition also has interesting implications for English as a lingua franca. ELF or ELT. When you look at typical definitions of English as a lingua franca, you get the impression that ELF, now I will say ELF, that ELF is a kind of thing. And this has to do with the power of concepts in more general terms. I always tell my students the way we think and talk about language influences the way we think and talk about learning a language or teaching a language or translating or all these things. And much of our current thinking about language is within this framework of theoretical descriptive models, according to which language is a something, a reservoir of linguistic means of expression, expressions, grammar, lexis, and so forth. So it's not a surprise that the thingness of ELF is deeply rooted in the intuitive perception and understanding of English teachers. And this teaching ELF is seen as teaching a certain variety of English. But when we take a closer look at this, it turns out that this is just not the case. Imagine a group of people in an international project, and they come from different language backgrounds, and they decide on using English as a lingua franca. Well, what do? Do they pick English as a lingua franca from off the shelf and use it? No. The native speaker in the group will say, well, no problem for me. Or a second language user, same. Or someone who is working in an international company, where they have been using English as a company language for the past 10 years. Well, someone from an ELT background might say, yeah, okay, it's a little bit rusty, my English, but I think I'll get along. And maybe there's another one, me only little English, but with a little help of my friends, so this kind of thing. So what is it? What is actually happening? Which language do they use? What kind of English? Each one of them uses his or her English. That is it. Whether it is the English of a native speaker, of a second language user, or of a learner. And they trust that they will get along on this basis, and they are aware of the fact that they will have to use certain strategies of accommodation. Native speakers in particular should not just, when there is a comprehension problem, speak louder, but adapt to the level of their interlocutors, like what we do with little children or when we talk about our things to people from the outside. Accommodation is all pervasive. Okay. Meaning negotiation strategies. So this is the area. We are using our own English in lingua franca situation for lingua franca purposes, not a certain variety. Well, standard English plays a big role in all this. And I want you to take a closer look at this. Again, imagine my aim was to learn something like Mid-Atlantic Standard English. So I think this is the kind of English Cary Grant spoke. I sometimes feel like it, not like Cary Grant, but oscillating between the British and the American, depending on whom I talk to. Now, when I say, I want to learn Mid-Atlantic Standard English, is this the Mid-Atlantic Standard English linguists aim to describe, and which they may have problems with? No. It is my own representation of Mid-Atlantic Standard English. Again, this constructivist view. It's my own cognitive, emotional version of Mid-Atlantic Standard English or Irish English or British English or American English or whatever. And it is based on the language of the people I like to talk to, and I profit from. It is possibly influenced by linguistic descriptions, which, by the way, are constructions themselves, only following different rules of construction. And what actually shapes my learning of Mid-Atlantic Standard English is this, my own cognitive, emotional construction and representation of it. And linguistic descriptions and teaching models of Mid-Atlantic Standard English only have an influence on my learning through the constructive process of mediation and adaptation. To put this on a somewhat more theoretical level, I would like to make a distinction between a strong version of a native speaker English orientation and a weak version of a native speaker English orientation. According to the strong version, learners are required to comply with the native speaker English teaching norms, and the closer they get, the better. Now, this is clearly based on an understanding of language learning as a behaviorist copying process. This kind of lurks in the background. And when in the literature you read about a critique of a standard English or native speaker orientation with the argument that this is flatly impossible, then again, these authors have, whether they are aware of it or not, they have such a strong version of a native speaker English orientation in mind. And they incorporate a kind of copying process understanding of language learning. But language learning is not, as we have seen, a copying process. However, in ELT practice, much of what is happening in terms of learning, teaching, and testing is shaped by such a copying process. It's shaped by the strong version of a native speaker orientation. So what we can identify here is a fundamental inconsistency in ELT thinking. On the one hand, this strong version of a native speaker English orientation. On the other hand, constructivist communicative concepts like autonomy, agency, ownership, and all these things. This just doesn't fit. Against the strong version, I would set the weak version of a native speaker English orientation. According to this version, learners take native speaker English as a model for orientation, but they create their own version of it. It's a model for orientation. Just think of someone who practices high jumping. This doesn't mean that I want to reach 2 meters or 3 meters, and if I don't, I have failed. It gives me a direction. If I jump in that direction, I have misunderstood something about high jumping. And this is an understanding of language learning as a constructivist process again, of cognitive and emotional creation. Against this background, we can take a look at ELT and ELF, research and practice, with regard to some theoretical beliefs and pedagogical orientations. First, ELT. ELT is, in ELT, an exonormative native speaker English orientation appears to be a given. So when you look at the educational regulations that hold for schools, when you talk to teachers, it's this exonormative orientation. And a strong version of this orientation is generally accepted by both teachers and learners. Any deviation from this model is at best tolerated, as I said before. It is never experienced as something positive. And even in communicative approaches, learning is oriented towards this native speaker English model. There is a new turn, which I already briefly alluded to, which comes up with bilingual classroom teaching, CLIL, content and language integrated learning. We noticed this in our own studies where we used eLearning activities to enhance the classroom, and where pupils would use blogs and forums and journals to write things. And we noticed that in this environment, they seem to open up and lose their inhibitions, and they just let it flow. Wonderful opportunity, I would assume, for an English teacher to pick up and to guide in a desirable direction. Endonormative processes from within this My English condition are not valued, well, maybe not even perceived. And because of the strong exonormative perspective, learners tend to stay partially alienated from their own creativity, which results then in frustration, anxiety, even fear. Now, in English as a lingua franca, research and practice, the theoretical beliefs and pedagogical orientations are quite different. ELF development is seen as a creative endonormative process. Deviations from native speaker English are accepted if they are communicatively successful. The focus is pretty much on comprehensibility. The endonormative nature of ELF development is regarded as incompatible with an exonormative native speaker English orientation. Emphasis so far has been on communication. Again, we have a new turn in her recent book, Barbara Seidelhofer. I was very pleased to read this. Talks about teaching ELF, and she emphasizes that it is not so much about language content, that is a certain variety, but that it is rather about the process of developing the kind of English users and learners are able to make authentic for themselves, including native speaker Englishes. So I think there is a need. You saw the focus or the criterion for success in ELF debates is largely comprehensibility. That is a very, very small area and very poor, actually, compared to what speakers want to achieve. there is certainly the need to go beyond communicative acceptability and to reach something like speaker satisfaction. We have done a few studies on this based on intercultural discussion groups about a certain sort of critical incident topic, which we video recorded and analyzed, and these things came out. There's also a need for more attention to written ELF communication. I indicated a few references, and you have it also in the list. Now, there is obviously a divide, a strong divide between ELT and ELF. And it all boils down to, I would say, it all boils down to endonormativity and exonormativity. ELF focuses endonormativity, ELT focuses on exonormativity. And because of ELT's exonormative bias, ELF-based pedagogic suggestions are met with suspicion in ELT. This is a quote from a German teacher and teacher educator, so working on a pretty high level. And when we talked about ELF, he said, well, no, ELF gives me the creeps. Do you want me to teach my pupils incorrect English? But is this what ELF pedagogy is or can be about? Certainly not. But there is a need for reconciliation between the two. On the one hand, there are these challenges out there arising from ELF-specific social linguistic realities. And a second reason is this inbuilt inconsistency in educational regulations. Our regulations for secondary schools, in the introductory statement, they talk about English as a lingua franca and intercultural communication and how important it is to prepare pupils for these challenges. But when you read on and go through the learning targets and the activities and all these things, it's all the same as it used to be 10 and 20 and 30 years ago. So there is a need for a reconciliation, and from both ends, something needs to be done. From the ELF end, I have the feeling it is a little bit easier. For ELF researchers and practitioners, it will be necessary to extend the endonormative view to include a weak native speaker English orientation, like what came up in Barbara Seidelhofer's publication. For ELT, I feel it is more difficult. The challenge is stronger. ELT would have to adopt an endonormative conceptualization of language learning and teaching, a My English approach, along with an acceptance of a constructivist, weak native speaker English orientation. And with this, we have the basis for a reconciliation, and we can talk about integrating, incorporating an ELF dimension into the foreign language classroom, which up until now, when you look at the literature and when you talk to practitioners, seem to be not possible because of the incompatibilities we talked about. Now, what could this mean? Teaching ELF, or rather teaching toward ELF communication. An important point concerns raising awareness for lingua franca manifestations of English out there. To increase tolerance. Tolerance both for others and for oneself. The second important focus is on developing ELF-specific comprehension skills to get accustomed to non-native speaker Englishes and accents and messy performance, to develop the ability to adjust to these accents and ways of performance. And then thirdly, there is a focus on developing ELF-specific production skills. Here we could list improving pragmatic fluency. Juliana Haus, in particular, emphasized this in her publications. Pragmatic fluency, knowing how to deal with certain difficult situations, be polite, discourse markers, and all these lubrication devices we need. And also to improve strategic skills for accommodation and collaborative negotiation of meaning in intercultural situations. Now, this can be achieved through exposure to a wide variety of ELF speakers. I would always argue for a focus on form within communicative tasks, and this with a weak native speaker English orientation. And what is of crucial importance is interaction in ELF communication. Another dimension concerns the focus on developing the learner's sense of ownership or agency to ensure speaker satisfaction and self-confidence. Now, what are the conditions that make this possible? Imagine the inhibited learner in school. When is it that these learners lose their inhibitions? They lose their inhibitions as soon as they become involved in real communication with real speakers. So through participation in an authentic speech fellowship or a certain communicative community of practice in a company. And the big question now, of course, but this has been with ELT theory and practice for decades, how can such liberating conditions be successfully implemented through educational approaches and scenarios? Well, a few approaches are around. Again, I want to mention CLIL, Content and Language Integrated Learning. Something similar is practice enterprise. This is where learners play company. And while they do these things and go through all the motions of writing emails and getting into contact and negotiating meetings and all these things, they acquire in an incidental way English. Creative writing for non-native speakers, but not creative writing in the sense as it is more often than not done, that a certain model is imposed onto the poor non-native speakers, but where their own agency and sense for ownership is developed. Pushed output processing, Meryl Swain's term, pushed output processing can be of great help here. That is to focus learners on working on their language, on their output while they communicate. But all this with increased self-satisfaction as a target, instead of better compliance with an external norm. I had a group of students once working on collaborative writing, and then they did pushed output processing or languaging, as Meryl Swain calls it. And then they came up with instances of successful languaging and instances of unsuccessful languaging. And I was surprised to read this in their term papers, and what it turned out was that they called successful languaging when the learners came to a conclusion which happened to be correct. And in cases where they came to a conclusion which happened to be incorrect, they said it's unsuccessful languaging. But no, it's both successful languaging, right? From this my language perspective. Authentic and autonomous web collaboration and web communication can play an important role here. But all this with the aim to explore and extend the learner's own creativity. Vygotski's zone of proximal development comes in here. A few words on e-learning. One of my pet topics. I've been working in this field for many, many years, and I'm convinced that e-learning opens up, in particular with Web 2 possibilities these days, a tremendous potential for enhancing classroom activities. In a classroom, you are inevitably restricted. I mean, there are 20, or in most cases 30 pupils, and you have these differences in competencies and proficiency levels and all these things. And even in bilingual classroom environments, a great potential for language learning is opened up, but it is not really exploited. With regard to reception, yes, but not with regard to production. And this is where e-learning comes in. An e-learning platform like Moodle, for instance, enhanced with Web 2 tools, forum, chat, Skype, wiki, and blog, and combined with online CLIL resources, provides a great potential for autonomous, authentic, and collaborative language learning. You have flexible practice activities, reading, writing, listening, speaking, with texts, images, sound, and video. And what is more, these days, you have real communication and interaction online. And you can tap into what pupils are doing anyways when they interact using the internet. And you can use this and exploit this for content and language integrated learning with new possibilities for incidental language learning. All this, I would always argue, should be embedded in a blended learning context where you have classroom activities, and I mainly see it as an environment that enhances classroom activities. Here are a few examples from our projects, European projects. I believe the slides will be available. Otherwise, you can send me an email, and I will send you all these things, and there you find, I believe, some interesting materials and approaches. My closing remark: let us embrace the non-native speaker's own English, guided by their own native speaker orientation, pushed by their communicative needs and identification purposes, fueled by their own creativity. According to the constructivist insight, a learner's own mark is more than being allowed to drop the copula or third-person S. It is rather about being allowed and encouraged to be yourself. And this is my last poem. Excellence in TESOL takes a giant step forward when learners are given the space for developing their own English, for being themselves, in keeping with their individual and social identities. And no closing remark with final quotes. A quote by Keith Gilead. When reading Tomlin, Keith was struck by the idea that students were writers and not merely people learning to write. That they already had meaningful things to express and that those gestures toward meaning had to take priority over the rigid, narrow, formal exercises laid out in many writing rooms. We can transfer this to our context and say that non-native speakers of English are speakers of English and not merely people learning English. And the last quote taken from the online discussion, which took place previous to the convention, Jane wrapped up things in this nice way. Taking ownership is really about identity, creativity, and the energy we use to express these in words. Using constructing language to communicate in a way that no other can exactly duplicate because of the user's inherent uniqueness. I see my own perception of my native language and its ecology change as I watch my students take ownership, learning its structures, experimenting with vocabulary and voice, and imprinting all with their own identity. I don't think it gets any better. Indeed. Here are a few references, and I extend my thanks to you.